more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Matthew Parks, who's the Parliamentary Coordinator of the Trade Federation, COSATU. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the programme.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having us.
All right, so COVID-19 already was huge pressure on labour, but then we had this unrest in the week, 2 weeks ago. Have you been able to get a sense of what the consequences of that unrest has been on labour?
It's been quite devastating across many industries. I think we all seen that the dozens and dozens of shopping centres in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng were burnt to the ground. That's affected thousands of retail workers at ShopRite, at Pick n Pay, at Pepco, etc. That's been quite devastating to them because these are workers who take care of the family. These are their jobs. We've seen in the clothing industry large numbers of factories destroyed, affecting thousands of workers. We saw also in the sugar industry, mills, farms being destroyed. As we saw in the media, many trucks being destroyed. So this has a huge impact upon these workers who don't make huge salaries, don't have significant savings. If they don't work, they don't get paid. Many of them also now fear losing their jobs. The stats are all kind of still early days, trying to figure what's the exact damage, which companies will reopen, how long will they take. But estimates say that we could lose up to 150,000 jobs. We hope it's significantly less. There has been good discussions between some of our unions like SABC and COSATU, who have been engaging the employees in the retail sector, the clothing sector, the agricultural sector, to see how we can save as many jobs as possible, how we can make sure these workers receive their salaries even whilst the companies are being rebuilt, also how we can get the goods back to the markets so communities have goods to buy, food to buy, etc. It's going to be quite tough. As you said, it's an additional burden upon workers and the families that we didn't need to have. We're already dealing with a deep economic recession, difficulties in Eskom and other SOEs, difficulties in dealing with the pandemic. So this has really made it much more difficult. But we're quite pleased, Peter, that COSATU tabled our 12-point plan in response to the disaster last week at Nedlac, to our partners in government and business, to the President as well. And we're quite pleased at how quickly we managed to move together as government, business and labour to come together with a package, essentially what we called for as COSATU. And I think we've seen now the Minister of Labour, the Minister of Finance have spoken to it in the past day. We're hopeful that things can keep moving quite quickly. We need to really get this relief out to workers and to communities and to businesses as quickly as possible, ideally from the beginning of next week, because many people are sitting at home for 3 weeks now with no money, no goods to buy or feed their families, and we need to give them a sense of hope and give them help as quickly as possible.
So some relief, but I guess it's never going to be enough. But I guess from your perspective, probably a good start with more that still needs to be done.
Yes, look, I mean, I don't think you can ever fully compensate people for the losses they've experienced. The Unemployment Insurance Fund doesn't cover people's salary to 100%. It's always been on a sliding scale of between 38 and 60% of your salary, up to a salary cap of 17,700 a month. But look, part of that is also about ensuring that you can reach as many people as possible. This is a worker and an employer contribution scheme. It has managed to do a significant amount of work over this past year. Has managed to pump out over 60 billion rand to more than 5.5 million workers in the course of the pandemic. We've put aside now 5.3 billion rand to cover workers in the restricted sectors during level 4, like tourism and liquor, restaurants, etc. We think it's enough now to also provide solidarity and relief to these affected workers and companies in KZN and Gauteng. And of course, we also need to look at giving relief to those sectors which remain under lockdown in level 3. It's not perfect, but this is dedicated relief to assist workers who have lost wages, to help companies rebuild whilst we give some relief to the workers. Other forms of relief have to come to the parties. So the insurance companies and SASRIA must help these companies rebuild quickly. We need to see tax relief, as government has promised, being given to these companies while they rebuild. But of course, we also need to give help to the unemployed, and hence the 350 Rand COVID-19 grant comes into effect hopefully from next week. But that one won't be just for these 2 provinces and affected communities. It must be for all 9 provinces, to all unemployed persons, because what we've seen during the violence, Peter, is that Yes, there was a political orchestration, there was a criminal coordination and opportunist elements, but it also did speak to a sea of poverty, of hopelessness, of desperation. And we think that 350 grant will help to alleviate some of the worst forms of poverty. But look, also we need to see other measures because government can do so much. The Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is workers' monies, can do so much. But we also need to see solidarity from the private sector. What can the banks do to help these companies to be rebuilt, to give holidays for loan payments to affected consumers and workers? But what can they also do to help inject liquidity into the economy? I think one of the positive stories we heard this week from SABC, the Retail Workers Union, is how they've engaged with Pick and Pay, which has given an assurance that they will not retrench any workers and they will commit to paying all workers their salaries. So we need to see that kind of solidarity from the private sector as well, because government and workers can do so much. We need to have a social compact spirit where all of us contribute and make compromises and sacrifices at times.
So the looting and the violence and the destruction of property is something that was unnecessary and in the end has added a burden that we could ill afford. Your Secretary General was talking about offering and giving an amnesty to people who had looted. But if we consider how much it cost, how do we then discourage people in the future? Because the socio-economic conditions that perhaps gave rise to this kind of action haven't disappeared and won't likely in the near future.
Sure, but I think a couple of things. One is that we need to alleviate some of the worst forms of poverty and hopelessness. So the 350 COVID-19 grant does give a sense of hope to people. As small as it is, you can see the queues of the post office. People are desperate to get it, to put some food into their stomachs. It's also been shown to help people go out and look for work. They've got some money for transport. On the criminal justice element, we need to see the ringleaders of this violence being brought to books. We've seen many of them instigating it on social media. We know in the public media discourse some of the people who have been active cheerleaders of it. Those are the people that we need to see the National Prosecuting Authority, the police, the courts tackling, because there has to be a sense of consequence management. People who had the ability to burn down shopping centers, that's not looters who burn down a shopping center, that's a criminal element which carried enough petrol to burn down physical buildings, but also to disable the fire extinguisher systems. So I think that's different from people who have looted out of poverty or hopelessness. But equally, we need to see a turnaround in the economy. You cannot sustain a society with 43% of unemployment levels, where every month you see thousands more being retrenched, losing wages, losing jobs, losing hope. That's a ticking time bomb that we as COSATU have been warning about for many years. And you can look at other countries around the world. If you look at Tunisia during the Arab Spring, it took a small little spark of an altercation between a police officer and a fruit hawker to implode society. And so right now we need to really tackle as never before. Government and business have to lead from the front on reducing unemployment. People who don't have jobs don't have hope. So we need to find ways of creating jobs, especially for young people, if you want to really sustain society and avoid a repetition of what we saw in the past. But equally, I think, Peter, on this front, we've had a decade of impunity where powerful people in government, and politicians, in the business, in the SOEs have been able to break the law with no consequences. We know these people who they are, corrupt people, and yet they've been allowed to get away with breaking the state, imploding the state-owned enterprises, breaking municipalities, looting. So society needs, if it wants to be rebuilt with a moral fabric, we need to see such people being taken to prison and being held accountable, the stolen assets being attached. We don't need to see them pontificating on Twitter, instigating violence, and people mobilizing people to break the law.
Mm-hmm. So the basic income grant continues now to become more and more of a focus and something that's going to go beyond debate now. I guess this is now quite urgent. And what sort of level do you think we should be looking at as a minimum?
Sure. Look, I mean, I think one thing is we must appreciate the level of poverty in society. Again, with 43% unemployment levels. That's why it's one of the most important interventions we suggested as COSATU in this disaster package was the 350 COVID-19 grant. Let's reinstate it. Yes, it's got many issues. The amount is too low. There's a lot of administrative issues. But we thought, let's reinstate it. It's affordable for government right now within the fiscal difficulties the state is facing. But we would want to see it being retained beyond March 2022, the end of the financial year. Let's retain it beyond this financial year. For those persons who have no source of income, who are unemployed, don't receive any social grants, etc. The ideal amount, we think, in the medium term would be at a minimum food poverty level, which is about 592 Rand. But let's first get the 350 extended beyond this year. Then let's work towards equalizing it to the food poverty level. And of course, we need to also thrash out how are we funded, who should be receiving it, what are the administrative processes, etc. But I think, Peter, our premise also is that when the economy is in a worst recession in the century, when unemployment is as highest ever, then that's when you need to have such social security nets. You don't need to kick it down the road just to say, well, let's delay it until times are better till we can afford it, because that's a wrong approach. You need it now when things are the worst, and as the economy picks up, as people find jobs, obviously they won't need their social security net of the state, and they'll be less dependent upon government for assistance.
The relationship between labour and employer traditionally is quite adversarial, but I guess at times of crisis and challenge as we've been facing, what kind of conversations have Labour been having with employers, especially employers who are literally on the edge and some who've disappeared?
Look, I mean, I think we're all in the same boat together. And yes, we might be on different decks within the boat, but workers need the company to survive. The company collapses, workers will pay the price with lost wages, lost pensions, lost jobs. But equally, employers need to treat workers like human beings, to respect their human rights, their constitutional labor rights, to pay them a living wage. There's no worker who's going to be productive if he's treated like a glorified slave. So in some areas, the relationship is not positive. We've seen reports recently of employers threatening to dismiss workers who don't get vaccinated, etc. Those are unnecessary fights. On the other hand, we've seen quite positive relations between employers and trade unions. If I look at the clothing industry, where SACTU, or Clothing Workers Union, has really developed a very strong social compact between the industry, between the trade unions and the bargaining council. They managed to really drive collective agreements from the COVID-19 UIF TERS to a vaccination rollout program, to making sure all workers are covered, to minimize retrenchments. I think those are pockets of excellence. But other areas, there is much work that needs to be done to improve the conditions. We appreciate everybody's feeling stress. It's not easy for businesses, but equally they need to appreciate that the first port of call when things are difficult is not to dismiss workers. Workers are parents, they've got children to take care of, they've got responsibilities. It was quite shameful that in the banking sector in the past few years, each of the big four banks retrenched about 2,000 workers. Yet they pay their cashiers about 300 Rand a day, and the CEOs of the big five banks make 150,000 Rand every single day. So you need to have a discussion there about what can you do besides retrenchment, besides cutting wages. On a positive front, we saw today Capitec announcing they're going to hire an additional 300 staff members. So we think those are the positive kind of examples that business should be looking at. If you do that, then you will help to improve labour market stability. Equally, we think we need for government also to reflect on itself. It was extremely unhelpful for government to walk away from the 2020 wage agreement, to delay engagements on the 2021 wage agreement, because when you undermine collective bargaining, you tell workers that the employer doesn't respect you, doesn't respect your right to earn a living wage and a decent salary. That makes it quite a poisoned atmosphere. But we're trying to fix it as COSATU.
All right, and that's where we'll leave it. Thank you very, very much indeed, Matthew Parks, Parliamentary Coordinator for the Trade Union Federation, COSATU. Thank you so much for your time.